She didn't know about the $1 trillion trust fund that had just been transferred into her name, but he knew exactly what he was doing when he walked out the door. The newborn in her arms hadn't stopped crying for 3 hours, but the formula was gone, the heat had been shut off, and the snow outside was falling so thick she could barely see the street through the frosted window. He had left her, not just emotionally, but physically abandoned them both in a ground-floor apartment with no money, no family, and winter closing in like a fist. She was starving, the baby was starving, but the lawyers who had been trying to reach her couldn't get through because he'd canceled her phone 2 days before he disappeared. What she did in the 72 hours that followed would transform her from a desperate mother on the edge of death into something he never anticipated. But by the time he came crawling back, begging on his knees with tears streaming down his face, it was far too late. Had he known what was waiting in her bloodline? Had he calculated that leaving her at her lowest point would somehow benefit him later? And when the truth finally reached her, when she discovered the inheritance that had been hers all along, would mercy be possible, or would the snow that nearly killed her become the cold justice he truly deserved? The apartment was so cold that morning that Emma Thorne could see her breath hanging in the air like small ghosts, but the baby bundled against her chest was warm, and that was all that mattered in the moment. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, but the hunger pangs had dulled into a distant ache that felt more like a memory than a physical sensation. The snow had been falling since midnight, but the window was drafty, and ice had begun forming on the inside of the glass in delicate, cruel patterns. Tyler had left 3 days ago, but the space he'd occupied in her life still felt raw, like a wound that wouldn't close. He'd taken everything, not just his clothes and his laptop, but the debit card, the checkbook, the spare cash she'd hidden in the coffee tin. But he'd missed the wedding ring she'd already pawned the week before to buy diapers. The formula was gone now too, but she'd been trying to nurse little Ava, with breasts that produced barely anything because her own body was consuming itself for lack of food. Emma had been beautiful once, tall and graceful with honey-colored hair and gray-green eyes that Tyler had said reminded him of the Pacific, but 3 days of starvation and stress had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the circles beneath those eyes. She'd met Tyler at a corporate event 2 years ago, but their whirlwind romance had hidden the truth about who he really was. He'd been charming and attentive, but the mask had begun slipping the moment she got pregnant. He'd been supportive in public, but behind closed doors he'd grown cold, calculating, distant. The night Ava was born, Emma had thought she'd seen tears in his eyes, but looking back now, she wondered if that had been the reflection of the hospital lights. He'd held the baby for exactly 4 minutes, but his hands had been stiff, awkward, and when the nurse tried to show him how to support Ava's head properly, he'd handed her back with an excuse about needing to make a work call. The phone on the kitchen counter had been disconnected, but Emma didn't know that yet when she tried to call her mother's old number, a number that had been out of service for 7 years, ever since the car accident that had taken both her parents on a rainy November evening. She'd been 21 then, but grief had made her older overnight. She'd had no siblings, but her parents had been her entire world, and losing them had set her adrift in ways she still didn't fully understand. Tyler had seemed like salvation when she met him, but salvation, she now understood, could wear the mask of damnation if you weren't careful. Ava whimpered against her chest, but Emma had nothing to give her except the soft humming of a lullaby her own mother used to sing. The melody was sad, but it was also a connection to something permanent, something that transcended the cold and hunger and fear. The radiator in the corner hadn't worked in 4 days, but the landlord had stopped returning her calls weeks ago when Tyler stopped paying rent. What Emma didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know because the lawyer's letters had been intercepted, their calls blocked, Their emails filtered into a spam folder by the same man who'd abandoned her. Was that her maternal grandfather, a man she'd never met and whose existence she'd only learned about in fragments from her mother's carefully guarded stories, had died 6 weeks earlier in Singapore? Gordon Whitfield had been a titan of international finance, but he'd also been a man of profound regret. He'd disowned his daughter, Emma's mother, Catherine, when she'd married a middle-class accountant instead of the oil heir Gordon had selected for her. But that regret had grown like a cancer over the decades. Catherine had never told Emma the full story, but she'd mentioned once, in a wine-softened moment, that her father had been a man who valued control above love, power above family. Gordon had spent his final years trying to locate his daughter, but by the time his private investigators found the truth that Catherine had died 7 years earlier, his own health was failing. The trust fund he'd established had been meant for Catherine, but the terms were ironclad. If Catherine predeceased him, everything would pass to her children. Emma had been the sole heir to a fortune that numbered in the trillions when assets, holdings, companies, and investments were calculated, but the notification process was complex, deliberate, and required in-person verification. The law firm handling the estate, Rothman, Silverman and Associates, based in Manhattan, had sent 3 courier packages, but Tyler had intercepted all of them. He'd signed for them with a forged signature, but his handwriting was too angular, too masculine to match Emma's flowing script. He'd opened the letters in private, but what he'd read had changed everything about his calculations. Tyler Bradford wasn't just a financial analyst at a mid-tier investment firm, but he was also a man who'd built his entire identity around the appearance of wealth he didn't actually possess. His apartment before meeting Emma had been rented furniture in a luxury building, but the credit cards funding his lifestyle were maxed out and hidden behind a network of balance transfers and minimum payments. He'd seen Emma as a project, but more than that, he'd seen her as someone vulnerable, someone without family, someone he could control. When he'd opened that first letter and seen the words $1 trillion trust fund, his first emotion hadn't been joy, but rage. Rage that this woman he'd manipulated, this woman he'd isolated and controlled, was about to become one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet, but rage most of all that he'd already married her, which meant divorce proceedings would entitle him to exactly nothing if she inherited before they'd been married for the minimum 10 years required by New York's complex equitable distribution laws. The calculation had been simple in his mind. Leave before she finds out, but make sure she's desperate enough that when he returns later, after establishing a pattern of support and care through carefully documented gifts and communication, he can reconcile and position himself for long-term access to the money. He'd been wrong about many things, but his greatest miscalculation was underestimating the woman he'd left behind. Emma stood from the worn couch, but her legs trembled with weakness as she carried Ava to the window. The snow was beautiful in its way, but it was also deadly, and she could see the drifts building against the building's entrance. The superintendent had stopped shoveling 2 days ago, but Emma suspected he'd been told by someone that the apartment's occupants were leaving soon anyway. She needed food, but more than that, Ava needed formula. The baby was 5 weeks old, but she'd already lost weight, and Emma could see the fragility in her tiny wrists, the way her skin seemed almost translucent in the gray morning light. Desperation was a physical thing now, but it sharpened rather than dulled Emma's thinking. In her previous life, before Tyler, before pregnancy, before the systematic isolation, Emma had worked as a freelance graphic designer, but she'd been good at it, talented enough to command high rates from corporate clients. Tyler had convinced her to stop taking contracts 6 months into her pregnancy, but he'd framed it as concern for her health rather than what it actually was, another layer of control. But Emma still had her laptop, though Tyler had assumed it was worthless when he'd left it behind, and she still had the password to her old professional portfolio site. The apartment building had Wi-Fi included in the rent, but it was slow and unreliable. She set Ava down in the bassinet, a second-hand purchase from a thrift store that was one of the few baby items Tyler hadn't convinced her was unnecessary, but she made sure to pile every blanket she owned around the tiny body. Emma's hands shook as she opened the laptop, but muscle memory guided her fingers to the keyboard. Her portfolio site was still active, but the contact form had been disabled. She reactivated it, but she also did something else. She posted a message on every freelance job board she could access, offering rush design services at a fraction of her usual rate. The responses came slowly at first, but within 2 hours she had 3 small jobs: a logo revision, a social media banner set, and a menu design for a local restaurant. The total payment would be $340, but it would take at least 3 days for the transfers to clear. Ava needed food before then, but Emma was out of options except one. She bundled the baby in every piece of warm clothing she could layer, but even then, Ava looked impossibly small. Emma put on her own winter coat, a thin thing that Tyler had always mocked as looking like it came from a garage sale, which it had, but she wrapped a scarf around her neck and pulled on boots that had holes in the soles. The walk to the church 6 blocks away took 40 minutes instead of 10 because Emma had to stop every few yards to catch her breath. But she kept moving because stopping felt like surrender. The snow was knee-deep in places, but she waded through it with Ava clutched to her chest like a talisman. St. Michael's Community Church was a modest brick building wedged between a laundromat and a bodega, but the lights inside were warm and golden. Emma had never been religious, but her mother had always said that churches were places of sanctuary, and she needed sanctuary now more than anything. The priest who answered her knock was a small man with white hair and kind eyes, but he didn't ask questions when he saw the baby and the desperation in Emma's face. His name was Father Thomas Riley, but he simply said, "Come in, child," and led her to a small office heated by a space heater that rattled but worked. Father Riley brought formula. The church kept emergency supplies for situations exactly like this, but he also brought sandwiches, hot coffee, and a wool blanket. Emma fed Ava first, but watching the baby drink, seeing color return to her tiny cheeks, broke something inside her. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, but now, in the warmth and safety of this small room, the tears came. Father Riley didn't try to stop her, but he sat quietly, occasionally refilling her coffee cup, and when she finally could speak, he listened. Emma told him everything, but not in chronological order. The story came out in fragments and flashbacks. She talked about meeting Tyler at that corporate event, but she also talked about how he'd slowly isolated her from the few friends she'd made in the city. She mentioned how he'd convinced her that her design work was just a hobby and that she should focus on being present for him. But she also remembered moments when he'd seemed genuinely happy, and she couldn't reconcile those memories with the man who'd left her to starve. Father Riley waited until she was finished, but then he said something that would change everything. "Have you checked your mail recently? Physical mail, I mean, not email." Emma shook her head, but the question seemed odd. "The mailbox is in the lobby," she said, "but I haven't been able to get down there in days." "Why?" "Because sometimes," Father Riley said carefully, "important information comes in ways we don't expect, and sometimes the people we trust are the ones who hide it from us." The priest's words planted a seed, but Emma was too exhausted to fully process them. Father Riley offered to let her stay in the church's small emergency shelter, a room with 2 cots usually reserved for homeless individuals during extreme weather. But Emma was grateful beyond words. That night, as Ava slept peacefully for the first time in days, Emma made a decision. She would survive this, but more than that, she would understand why it had happened. The next morning, with Father Riley's help, she accessed the apartment building's lobby. The mailbox was stuffed with letters, but 3 of them were from Rothman, Silverman, and Associates. The return address was embossed in gold, but Emma's hands trembled as she opened the first one. The words swam before her eyes at first, but then they crystallized into sentences that didn't make sense. Trust fund established by Gordon Whitfield, and total estimated value of $1.2 trillion USD across liquid and non-liquid assets, and sole beneficiary as verified through genetic testing coordinated with your mother's medical records. Emma read the letter 3 times, but the words didn't become more real. She opened the second letter, which was dated a week after the first, but its tone was more urgent. The third letter, dated just 4 days ago, indicated that the firm was concerned about the lack of response and was preparing to initiate in-person contact through local authorities if necessary. At the bottom of the third letter was a phone number labeled 24-hour emergency air contact line. Emma borrowed Father Riley's phone, but her fingers shook so badly she had to dial twice. The woman who answered identified herself as Patricia Rothman, senior partner, but her voice was professional, yet warm. "Emma Thorne?" Patricia asked, and Emma could hear the relief in her voice. "We've been trying to reach you for 6 weeks. Can you verify your mother's full maiden name and your date of birth?" Emma provided the information, but she felt like she was moving through a dream. Patricia asked several more verification questions, but each answer seemed to unlock another level of a reality Emma couldn't quite grasp. "Ms. Thorne," Patricia finally said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but it's been verified by 3 independent law firms and 2 international accounting agencies. Your grandfather, Gordon Whitfield, passed away 6 weeks ago, but he left everything to his daughter, Catherine, your mother. Since Catherine predeceased him, you are the sole heir to his estate. This includes controlling interests in 17 Fortune 500 companies, properties across 6 continents, and a portfolio of investments that make you, as of this moment, one of the wealthiest individuals in human history." Emma couldn't speak, but she could hear Ava stirring in the background. "Ms. Thorne," Patricia's voice was gentle, "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to come to our office in Manhattan as soon as possible. We have security concerns. People will do terrible things when this much money is involved. Can you get here?" Emma thought about Tyler, but she also thought about the 3 days she'd spent starving. "Yes," she said, "but I need help." Patricia's response was immediate. "A car will be at your location within the hour. Pack nothing. We'll provide everything you need. Just bring your identification and your baby." The next 72 hours moved with surreal speed, but Emma navigated them with a clarity born of survival. Patricia Rothman wasn't just a lawyer, but she was also a woman who'd built her career on protecting vulnerable heirs from predators. She arranged for Emma and Ava to stay in a secure penthouse suite in Manhattan, but she also brought in doctors, nutritionists, and security specialists. The medical team was horrified by Emma's condition, but they treated her with dignity while bringing her body back from the edge of starvation. Ava was examined by a pediatric specialist who confirmed that the baby had been malnourished, but with proper care, she would recover fully. Patricia's team also did something else. They investigated Tyler Bradford with the thoroughness of a military operation. What they uncovered was a pattern of financial fraud, identity theft, and manipulation stretching back a decade. Tyler had targeted women before Emma, but she was the first one who'd ended up pregnant, and that had complicated his usual exit strategy. The intercepted letters were the smoking gun. But Patricia's investigators also discovered that Tyler had been monitoring Emma's email and phone for months. He'd created forwarding rules that sent any communication containing words like inheritance, estate, or trust fund to a hidden folder he controlled remotely. He knew, Patricia said, showing Emma the digital forensics report. Not the full amount, perhaps, but he knew something substantial was coming, and he made a calculated decision to leave you at your most vulnerable, establish separation, but maintain enough documented concern that he could claim abandonment was never his intent. Emma looked at the evidence, but what she felt wasn't anger. Not yet. It was a cold, crystalline understanding of exactly who Tyler had been all along. "What would you like to do?" Patricia asked, but the question was layered with meaning. Emma thought about it for a long moment, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I want him to know, not through lawyers or letters. I want to see his face when he realizes what he lost." Patricia smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." The trap was simple but elegant. Patricia's firm leaked information through carefully chosen channels that Emma Thorne had been located and was being represented by Rothman, Silverman and Associates, but the leaked information suggested she was contesting a modest inheritance and needed legal help with a difficult ex-husband. The amounts mentioned in the controlled leak were substantial enough to attract attention, 50 million, maybe 60, but nowhere near the truth. Tyler took the bait in less than 24 hours, but his approach was calculated. He sent flowers to the law office with a card that read, "Emma, I've made mistakes, but I never stopped loving you and Ava. Please let me make this right. T." Patricia forwarded the card to Emma, but she also showed her the private investigator's report on Tyler's activities over the past week. He'd been living in a hotel suite paid for with a cash advance from a high-interest loan, but he'd been researching divorce law and making calls to 3 different attorneys specializing in high-net-worth marital asset recovery. "He still thinks he can manipulate you," Patricia observed. "But more than that, he thinks you're vulnerable enough to fall for it." Emma looked at the flowers. Expensive roses, the kind Tyler had sent her when they first started dating, but she felt nothing except a distant memory of who she'd been before. "Set up a meeting," she said, "but I want you there and I want everything recorded." The meeting was arranged for a conference room in Patricia's office building, but the space had been chosen specifically for its psychological impact. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and original artwork that Patricia casually mentioned had been purchased at auction for barely 8 figures. Tyler arrived wearing a suit Emma had never seen before, but she noticed the way his eyes cataloged everything in the room, calculating, assessing. He'd shaved and gotten a haircut, but there were dark circles under his eyes that even makeup couldn't quite hide. When he saw Emma, his expression transformed into practiced remorse, but she could see the predator beneath the mask now. She'd learned to see it during her 3 days in the snow. "Emma," he said, and his voice broke in exactly the right place. "God, I've been so worried. When I heard you'd been found, that you and Ava were safe, I couldn't believe—" He moved toward her, but Patricia stepped smoothly between them. "Mr. Bradford," Patricia said coolly, "please sit down. Ms. Thorne has agreed to this meeting, but there are ground rules." Tyler's mask slipped for just a moment, but then he recovered and took a seat across from Emma. "Of course. I understand. Emma, I just want to explain. You left us to starve," Emma said, but her voice was calm, factual. "You took everything, but you calculated that I'd be desperate enough to take you back later. You intercepted legal correspondence meant for me because you knew something was coming, but you couldn't control when or how." Tyler's face went pale, but he tried to recover. "I don't know what you've been told, but—" Patricia slid a folder across the table. This is a forensic analysis of your electronic surveillance of Ms. Thorne's accounts, but it also includes a timeline of the intercepted correspondence from our firm. You signed for 3 courier packages using a forged signature, but you were sloppy. The building's security camera caught you. Tyler opened the folder, but Emma watched his hands start to shake. The question, Patricia continued, is what Ms. Thorne wants to do about it. Mail fraud is a federal crime, but forgery and identity theft add additional charges. She could have you arrested right now. There are 2 federal agents waiting outside this office, but she wanted to give you an opportunity to explain yourself first. Tyler looked at Emma, but she saw the moment he decided to try a different tactic. His expression shifted to anger, self-righteousness. You think you're better than me now because you got lucky with some inheritance? You were nothing when I met you, Emma. No family, no prospects, just a lonely girl with a dead-end freelance career. I gave you everything. You gave her isolation and control, Patricia interrupted. But you also gave her a gift, though you didn't mean to. You showed her exactly what you were capable of. Now she gets to decide what comes next. Emma stood, but she moved to the window overlooking the park. The snow had stopped falling, but the landscape was transformed, pristine and white. She thought about the apartment, but she also thought about the moment Ava had finally fallen asleep after 3 days of crying from hunger. I inherited 1.2 trillion, Emma said, but she didn't turn around. Not 50 million, not 60 million, 1.2 trillion with a T. My grandfather was Gordon Whitfield, but you wouldn't know that name because you never actually cared about my family. The lawyers have been trying to reach me for 6 weeks, but you intercepted everything because you thought you could time your return for maximum advantage. Tyler's face had gone from pale to gray, but when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Emma, please. She turned to face him, but her expression was something he'd never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but a cold, absolute understanding. You left your newborn daughter to starve in the snow because you thought it would give you leverage later. You didn't know she'd be inheriting kingdoms. You just knew she'd be inheriting something, but you were willing to let her die for it. I would never, Tyler started, but the words died when he saw Emma's eyes. I want you to know something, Emma said. Every single day for the rest of your life, you're going to remember that you had everything, a wife who loved you, a daughter, a future, and you traded it for what you thought would be a better deal. You're going to read about me in Forbes, but you'll read about Ava too when she's older. You're going to see the life we build, the good we do, but you'll know you could have been part of it if you'd been capable of basic human decency. Tyler's composure finally cracked. He dropped to his knees, but his face was wet with tears that looked real, but might have been calculated even now. Please, Emma, please, I'll do anything. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love Ava. Please. Emma looked at him for a long moment, but then she turned to Patricia. I want full custody, a restraining order, but I also want him prosecuted for the mail fraud and forgery. He doesn't get to walk away this time. Consider it done, Patricia said, but she was already texting the federal agents. Emma picked up her bag, but before she left, she looked at Tyler one last time. You came here begging, but the tragedy is that some part of me actually feels sorry for you. Not because of what you're going to lose. You lost that the moment you walked out the door, but because you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing you're the kind of person who could do this to their own child. That's a prison money can't buy your way out of. She walked out of the conference room, but she didn't look back. In the months that followed, Emma's life transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable during those 3 days in the snow. But she never forgot what that cold felt like. She established a foundation dedicated to supporting abandoned mothers and at-risk infants. But she also funded housing initiatives and food security programs across the country. Ava grew healthy and strong, but Emma made sure her daughter would know the full story someday. Not to teach her to hate her father, but to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that the greatest inheritance wasn't money, but character. Tyler Bradford was convicted of federal mail fraud and served 18 months in a minimum security facility, but his real punishment was exactly what Emma had predicted. He would watch her rise from every prison cell, every parole hearing, every moment of his diminished life, but he would never be part of it. On the day Tyler was released, he received a single letter from Emma, but it wasn't gloating or cruel. It simply said, "I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I'll ever forget. I hope you find a way to become the person you pretended to be. For your sake, not mine." Tyler kept that letter for the rest of his life, but whether it brought him peace or torment was a question only he could answer. Emma's story became legend in certain circles, the woman who'd been left to die in the snow but rose to become one of the most powerful philanthropists in history. But she never courted publicity. She lived quietly with Ava, but she used her resources to quietly change millions of lives. And on cold winter nights, when the snow fell soft and thick outside her windows, Emma would hold her daughter close and remember that the coldest moments had taught her the warmth of her own strength, but more importantly, they'd taught her that justice, when served cold, could also be merciful. The question wasn't whether Tyler had learned his lesson, but whether the world had learned that underestimating desperate mothers was the greatest mistake any predator could make. The boardroom on the 47th floor of Whitfield Tower overlooked Manhattan in all its glittering complexity, but Ava Thorne stood at the window with her mother's same gray-green eyes, though hers held something different, not the hard-won wisdom of survival, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd been raised to understand that power meant responsibility. She was 20 now, but she carried herself with a grace that made her seem older, wiser. Her speech was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, but Emma watched her daughter from across the room and felt the weight of 2 decades compress into a single moment of profound gratitude. "You ready?" Emma asked, but her voice was soft, maternal despite the corporate setting. Ava turned and smiled, but it was a smile that contained multitudes. "I've been ready my whole life, Mom. You made sure of that." The Whitfield Foundation's annual gala had become one of the most important philanthropic events in the world, but it wasn't the money that made it significant. It was the focus. 20 years ago, Emma had made a promise to herself in a freezing apartment, while her newborn daughter cried from hunger, but that promise had evolved into a mission. No mother would ever face what she'd faced, and no child would ever go hungry because of someone else's cruelty or indifference. The foundation had built housing for 15,000 families, but it had also funded medical clinics, food security programs, and legal aid services for abandoned mothers. The numbers were staggering, over 3 million lives directly impacted, but countless more touched by the ripple effects. Yet Emma had never lost sight of the individual stories behind the statistics. Tonight's gala was special for another reason, but only Emma and a handful of her closest advisors knew why. Patricia Rothman, now 73 but still sharp as a blade, approached with 2 glasses of champagne. She'd become more than Emma's attorney over the years, but rather the godmother Ava had never had and the friend Emma had desperately needed. "He's here," Patricia said quietly, but there was no judgment in her voice, only a question. Emma took the champagne but didn't drink. "Where?" "Back corner table. He looks—" Patricia paused, searching for the right word. "Smaller than I remember." Emma had known Tyler would come. She'd made sure the invitation reached him through channels that couldn't be ignored. But she hadn't told Ava yet. That conversation would come later, but tonight was about something else entirely. The ballroom filled with donors, activists, celebrities who'd made the foundation their pet cause, but also the people who'd actually been helped. Mothers who'd rebuilt their lives, children who'd grown up healthy because someone had cared enough to intervene. Emma had insisted on that mix from the beginning, but it meant her galas felt less like society events and more like family reunions. Father Thomas Riley, now 91 and moving slowly with a cane, made his way to Emma's side. He'd been at every gala, but his presence was more than ceremonial. He'd been the first person to show Emma that kindness still existed in the world, and she'd never forgotten. "You've built something extraordinary," he said, but his eyes were misty. "Your mother would be so proud." "I wish she could have known," Emma said, but the old grief was softer now, wrapped in years of healing. About her father, about all of this. She died thinking she'd been rejected, but Gordon spent his last years trying to find her. "She knows now," Father Riley said with the certainty of faith, "and she's watching over both of you." The lights dimmed, but a spotlight found Ava on the stage. Emma's daughter had studied international relations at Columbia, but she'd also spent her summers working in the Foundation's field offices, not as the heiress observing from a distance, but as a volunteer sleeping in the same conditions as everyone else, eating the same food, facing the same challenges. She'd inherited her mother's determination, but she'd been spared the trauma that had forged it. 20 years ago, Ava began, but her voice carried across the silent ballroom. "My mother was left to die in the snow with a 5-week-old baby. She had no food, no heat, no hope, but she had something that couldn't be taken away. The absolute refusal to let cruelty have the final word. Tonight, I want to tell you what she's never told anyone publicly, the full story of those 3 days, but also what came after." Emma felt her breath catch, but she'd approved Ava's speech earlier. They'd worked on it together over months of conversations that had been painful but necessary. The room remained silent as Ava spoke, but Emma could see people leaning forward, captivated. Ava talked about the apartment, but she also talked about Father Riley and St. Michael's Church. She mentioned Patricia Rothman's fierce protection, but she also spoke about the doctors and nutritionists who'd brought her mother back from the edge. She described the Foundation's work in concrete terms, the housing units built, the meals served, the legal victories won. But she also shared letters from mothers who'd been saved, children who'd grown up healthy, families that had been kept together when they might have been destroyed. "But here's what my mother taught me," Ava said. But now her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about taking the worst moment of your life and transforming it into someone else's salvation. That's what the Whitfield Foundation has done, but it's also what every single person in this room can do, starting tomorrow." The applause was thunderous, but Emma wasn't watching the crowd. She was watching the back corner table where Tyler Bradford sat alone. He'd aged badly, but that wasn't entirely fair. He'd aged like someone who'd spent 2 decades living with consequences. His hair was gray, but it was the kind of gray that came from stress rather than dignified aging. He'd lost weight, but it made him look gaunt rather than fit. He wore a suit that was nice but not expensive, but Emma could see it had been carefully maintained. Perhaps the same suit he'd worn to other events, where he hoped to recapture some fragment of the life he'd lost. Tyler had been released from prison 18 years ago, but the conviction had destroyed whatever career he'd built on lies. He'd worked a series of mid-level administrative jobs, but nothing that matched his former aspirations. He'd never remarried, but Emma's investigators reported he'd had several relationships that ended badly when the women discovered his past. He lived alone in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens, but he'd stayed out of trouble. Whether from genuine reform or simple exhaustion, Emma couldn't say. She'd invited him for a reason, but it wasn't cruelty. After Ava's speech, after the standing ovation, after the donors had pledged another $340 million to the foundation's work, the exact amount Emma had earned from those 3 desperate freelance jobs, but scaled to meaningful impact, Emma made her way to Tyler's table. He stood when he saw her approaching, but his movement was uncertain and his face showed genuine fear. "Emma," he said, but the word came out hoarse. "I didn't think you'd actually want to see me. I came because the invitation said—" "I know what it said," Emma interrupted gently. "Please, sit." They sat across from each other, but the silence stretched for a long moment. Emma studied the man who'd once controlled her life, but what she felt wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to curiosity, as if she were looking at a stranger who happened to share history with a person she used to be. "Why did you invite me?" Tyler finally asked, but his voice was small, defeated. "Because Ava asked me to," Emma said simply. "She's known about you her whole life. I never lied to her about what happened, but a few months ago she asked if you'd ever tried to reach out, if you'd ever tried to apologize or make amends. I told her you'd sent letters over the years, but I'd never responded." Tyler's hands trembled on the table. "I meant every word of those letters, but I knew I had no right to expect anything from you. I destroyed everything, Emma, I know that. I live with it every single day." "Do you understand why you did it?" Emma asked, but the question was genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "I've spent 20 years trying to understand, but I've never been able to reconcile the person who walked out that door with the person who sent flowers and begged." Tyler was silent for a long time, but when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of hard-won self-knowledge. "I was terrified of being ordinary. My whole life, I'd built this identity around being special, being successful, being the kind of person who deserved extraordinary things, but it was all performance. When I saw that letter about your inheritance, I panicked because I realized you were about to become genuinely extraordinary. But I was still just me, a fraud. So I convinced myself I was making a strategic move, but the truth is I was just running away from my own inadequacy." "And now?" Emma asked. "Now I'm a 54-year-old administrative assistant at a non-profit that helps formerly incarcerated people find housing," Tyler said, but there was no self-pity in his voice. "I make $42,000 a year, but I live simply. I volunteer at a soup kitchen on weekends, but I don't tell people who I am or what I did. I just show up and work. I've been in therapy for 16 years, but I still don't know if I'm capable of real change or if I'm just performing a different role." Emma absorbed this, but she found herself believing him, not because she was naive, but because the years had taught her to recognize genuine humility versus performed remorse. "Ava wants to meet you," she said quietly. "Not because she wants a father, she's never needed one, and frankly, you forfeited that right a long time ago. But because she wants to understand where she came from, but also because she's studying restorative justice and believes people are more than the worst thing they've ever done." Tyler's eyes filled with tears, but he made no move to wipe them away. "I don't deserve that." "No," Emma agreed, "but maybe that's exactly why it matters. Ava didn't grow up with the trauma I survived, but she grew up with the legacy of it, the foundation, the work, the knowledge that her mother was left to die. She could have grown up angry, but instead, she grew up determined to break cycles. Maybe meeting you is part of that." "What do you want from me?" Tyler asked, but the question was desperate, lost. Emma considered this carefully, but when she answered, her voice was firm. "I want you to tell her the truth, not the version that makes you look better, not the strategic omissions, but the actual truth about why you left and what you were thinking. I want you to answer every question she asks, but I also want you to understand that this isn't about redemption. You don't get to walk away from this meeting feeling like you've been forgiven or like you've earned some kind of closure. This is about Ava's healing, not yours." Tyler nodded, but his face showed he understood. "When?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. Lunch at a restaurant near Columbia. Public, neutral ground. I'll be there, but Patricia will be too, and there will be security. If at any point Ava wants to leave, we leave, but there's no second chance at this conversation." "I understand," Tyler said. "Emma, I know I have no right to say this, but—" "Don't," Emma interrupted gently. "Whatever you need to say, save it for Ava. She deserves your honesty more than I deserve your apologies." Emma stood to leave, but Tyler spoke one more time. "You became everything I pretended to be. That's what hurts most. Not what I lost, but knowing that you were always capable of this, but I was too broken to see it." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "The difference between us, Tyler, wasn't capability. It was character. You made choices that prioritized yourself over everyone else, but I made choices that prioritized Ava over everything else. That's not virtue, that's just love. I hope you've learned what that actually means." She walked away, but she felt lighter than she had in years. The next day's lunch was everything Emma had promised. Public, neutral, carefully supervised. Ava arrived first, but her nervousness was evident in the way she kept adjusting her watch, a gesture Emma recognized as her daughter's tell when facing something difficult. Tyler arrived exactly on time, but he looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the meeting had physically compressed him. When Ava saw him, Emma watched her daughter's face cycle through emotions, curiosity, anger, sadness, determination, before settling into something like scientific observation. They talked for 2 hours, but Emma mostly listened. Ava asked the hard questions. "Why did you leave? Did you ever love us? Do you understand what your choices did?" But Tyler answered with a rawness that was difficult to witness. He didn't defend himself, but he also didn't wallow in self-pity. He simply told the truth, but the truth was ugly and complicated and human. At one point, Ava asked, "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" Tyler thought about this for a long time. "Everything," he finally said. But that's too easy an answer. If I'm being completely honest, I would have wanted to be a different person, someone capable of love without calculation, someone who could see you as my daughter instead of a complication to my plans. But I wasn't that person then, but I don't know if I'm that person now either. I hope I am, but hoping isn't the same as knowing." Ava nodded, but Emma could see her daughter processing this with the sharp, analytical mind she'd inherited from Emma, but honed through years of education and experience. "I don't forgive you," Ava said finally, but her voice wasn't cruel, it was simply honest. "I might someday, but I also might not. But I understand you better now, but that understanding doesn't erase what you did. It just makes it more tragic." "I know," Tyler said, "and that's more than I deserve." They parted with no promises of future contact, but also without the door completely closed. Emma watched Tyler walk away down Broadway, but she felt Ava take her hand, her daughter's grip strong and sure. "How do you feel?" Emma asked. "Like I just met a character from a story I've always known," Ava said thoughtfully. "He's real, but he's also exactly who you told me he was. I'm glad I met him, but I'm also glad I grew up without him. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Emma said, but she pulled her daughter close. That evening, back in the penthouse that had been Emma's home for 20 years, but had never quite stopped feeling like borrowed space, Emma and Ava sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights were beautiful, but Emma found herself thinking about that ground-floor apartment, the frosted windows, the snow falling thick and deadly. "Mom," Ava said quietly, "do you ever regret not taking him back? Not for romance, but just so I could have had a father." Emma considered this. question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she finally said, "because taking him back would have taught you that love means accepting cruelty, but raising you without him taught you that love means protecting what matters most. You turned out extraordinary, not despite his absence, but because I refused to let his choices define our future." "I'm proud of you," Ava said, but the words held weight. "For surviving, yes, but also for building something beautiful from something terrible. That's the real inheritance, Mom. Not the money, but the example." Emma felt tears on her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "You're going to do even more than I did," she said, "because you're starting from a place of strength rather than survival. But you also understand what it means to struggle. That combination is powerful." "We'll do it together," Ava said. "For another 20 years, but hopefully longer. The work isn't done." "No," Emma agreed. "But tonight, let's just be grateful for how far we've come." They sat in comfortable silence as the city lights blazed below them, but Emma thought about all the mothers and children those lights represented, some thriving, some struggling, some fighting battles no one would ever know about. The foundation would continue its work, but so would she, because the woman who'd been left to starve in the snow had learned that the greatest victory wasn't surviving the cold. It was ensuring others never had to face it alone. 20 years had passed, but the memory of those 3 days remained sharp, precious even, because they'd forged everything that came after. Tyler had taught her what to avoid, but Ava had taught her what to build toward, and in the end, that was the story Emma wanted told. Not the tragedy of betrayal, but the triumph of transformation. The snow would fall again this winter, as it always did, but Emma would watch it from warmth and safety, with her daughter beside her and a legacy stretching out before them like an unwritten promise. And somewhere in Queens, Tyler Bradford would watch the same snowfall and think about the life he'd thrown away. But perhaps, just perhaps, he would also think about the man he might still become. The question wasn't whether he deserved redemption, but whether he was brave enough to pursue it without expectation of reward. That was a question only time could answer, but Emma had learned that some questions were more valuable than their answers. She pulled Ava closer, breathed in the cold air that no longer held any terror, and smiled at the future, uncertain, challenging, but entirely theirs to shape. The inheritance had given them resources, but the struggle had given them purpose. And in the end, purpose was the only currency that truly mattered.